For 55 years, Virgil Suttles farmed 400 acres outside the town of Hadley, drove the same rusted pickup truck, and never once asked anyone for help. He had $14 in his checking account the morning he walked into First National Bank and asked for a $5,000 loan. The new branch manager took one look at Virgil's cracked boots and calloused hands, glanced at the balance on his screen, and said no. Didn't check another file, didn't ask a single question. But Virgil Suttles didn't walk into that bank because he needed money. He walked in because he was about to entrust $2 million to a town of 2,200 people, and he needed to know what kind of man was sitting behind that desk. That story begins on a Saturday morning in April. The air over Hadley smelled like wet earth after a night of rain, and the fields on both sides of the county road were just starting to show the first pale green of early planting season. Virgil climbed into his 1994 Ford pickup at 6:45, the way he had every Saturday morning for 2 years ever since Opal died. The truck's paint had faded from blue to something closer to gray, and the engine knocked twice before it caught, but Virgil did Montaigne. He'd driven this truck for 30 years, and he planned to drive it 30 more if his knees held out. The passenger seat had a permanent dep in it shaped exactly like Opal after 5 decades of sitting in the same spot on every drive into town. Virgil never moved the seat back. He never adjusted the mirror she'd angled toward herself for checking her lipstick before they walked into church or the diner or the hardware store. Some mornings he glanced at that mirror and caught nothing but the road behind him, and that was enough to remind him she wasn't there. He didn't need much to remember. The whole truck remembered for him. In the glove compartment sat a bottle of lavender hand cream, half empty, the cap cracked from years of use. Opal kept it there because her hands dried out on long drives. Virgil had never cleaned it out. He'd never even opened the glove compartment since the funeral. He just knew it was there the way he knew the sun would come up over the east field every morning and the creek behind the barn would freeze every January. Some things you didn't need to check. They just were. He drove the 7 miles into town with the window cracked 2 inches, the morning air cool against his face. The fields stretched flat on both sides, 400 acres of soybeans to the south, and a back 40 where the soil was different, darker, richer, in ways that had mattered more than anyone in Hadley ever knew. Virgil passed the grain elevator at the edge of town, turned left on Main Street, and parked in front of the diner at 7:15. Same spot, same time, same Saturday. The bell above the door jingled when he walked in. "Morning, Virgil." Jolene was already pouring his coffee. She had his cup on the counter before he sat down. Black, no sugar. She'd been pouring it the same way for 15 years, ever since she took over the diner from her mother. "Morning, Jolene. Eggs and toast if it's not too much trouble." She smiled. "It's never trouble, Virgil. You know that." He sat at the counter, third stool from the left. The vinyl was cracked, and the padding had gone flat years ago, but it was his stool. Nobody in Hadley sat there on Saturday mornings. Everybody knew. It was one of those unspoken arrangements that small towns run on, the kind of agreement that never gets written down, but never gets broken either. Jolene set his plate down a few minutes later. 2 eggs over easy wheat toast, a small pile of hash browns she always added without charging him. Virgil ate slowly. He watched the street through the window. A few cars passed. The town was quiet on weekend mornings. Not empty, just unhurried, the way places get when everyone knows where everything is and nobody's in a rush to find it. "How's the planting?" Jolene asked, wiping down the counter. "Coming along. Got the south field in last week. Soybeans again." Virgil took a sip of coffee. "Soybeans have been good to me. No reason to stop now." Jolene laughed. She didn't know how true that was. Nobody in that diner did. Nobody in the entire town of Hadley had any idea what soybeans, And a woman who understood money the way most people understand breathing, had built over 50 years of patience and quiet discipline. But that part of the story was still sitting in a bank database, waiting behind a screen that a young manager hadn't bothered to open. Virgil left $3 on the counter for a $2 breakfast. He did that every week. Jolene always told him it was too much. He always told her it wasn't enough. It was their routine, steady and small and unchanged, the way Virgil preferred most things in his life to be. He stepped outside and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking up the street toward the bank. The morning sun caught the glass front of the building and turned it bright white. Virgil reached into his shirt pocket and touched what he carried there every day. A pair of reading glasses, wire frames, a small scratch on the left lens. Opal's glasses. She'd worn them every evening at the kitchen table, reading the newspaper or going over the farm's accounts in a ledger she kept in the drawer beside the stove. When her eyes got too tired at the hospital, when the light in the room hurt and the medication made everything blurry, she'd taken them off and set them on the bedside table and never put them back on. Virgil had picked them up the morning after she died and slid them into his shirt pocket, and they had been there every day since. Not because he was sentimental, because putting them in a drawer felt too much like giving up. "All right, Opal," he said under his breath. "Let's go see about this new fella." The bank was 3 blocks from the diner. Virgil walked. His knees weren't what they used to be, but he didn't carry a cane. Opal had told him once that the day he started leaning on a cane was the day he'd start feeling old, and he figured she was right about that. She'd been right about most things. That was something Virgil had understood early in their marriage and never stopped appreciating, even when it meant he was wrong, which was often. He pushed open the glass door of First National Bank and stepped inside. The air conditioning hit him immediately, that aggressive cold that banks and hospitals seem to share, as if temperature could substitute for trust. Darlene saw him first. She'd been behind that counter for 31 years. Gray hair pulled back tight, bifocals on a chain around her neck. A memory that could hold every account number and every grandchild's birthday in a town of 2,200 people. Darlene was the kind of woman who made a small town bank work, not because she understood finance, though she did, but because she understood people. She knew which farmers were struggling before they said a word. She knew which young couples were about to apply for their first mortgage by the way they walked through the door, nervous and hopeful, and trying not to show either one. And she knew Virgil Suttles' accounts, every single one of them, better than anyone alive. "Well, look who it is." She smiled wide. "Virgil Suttles. Haven't seen you in here since January. Haven't needed anything since January. What brings you in today?" Virgil glanced toward the glass-walled office in the back of the building. A young man sat behind the desk, typing on a laptop. Dark suit, clean-shaven, a haircut that cost $40 in a city and looked out of place in a town where most men got theirs at the barber shop next to the feed store for $12. "That the new manager?" Virgil asked. Darlene's smile faded slightly. She lowered her voice. "Marcus transferred out. This is Clyde Halstead. Been here about 6 weeks. He any good?" Darlene looked at Virgil over the top of her glasses the way she did when she wanted to say something she couldn't say out loud. "He's efficient, I'll say that much." Virgil nodded. He understood exactly what she wasn't saying. Efficient meant fast. Efficient meant numbers on screens. Efficient meant the kind of banking that worked fine in a city where nobody knew your name, and worked terribly in a town where everybody knew your grandmother's maiden name. "I'd like to talk to him about a loan," Virgil said. Something shifted behind Darlene's eyes. She knew what Virgil was about to walk into. She knew the trust account, the one Opal had built deposit by deposit for decades, the one that sat behind a flag in the system she herself had placed there years ago, with a note that read, "Priority client, full review required for any transaction." She knew exactly how much money was sitting in the Suttles family trust because she had watched it grow from nothing into something that would make most bankers in the state sit up straight. And she knew that none of that would show on the screen Clyde Halstead was about to look at because Clyde Halstead had never once opened the full profile. She knew because she'd checked. Virgil, she said carefully, you sure about that? I'm sure. She studied him for a moment, the way you study someone you've known for 30 years when you can see them walking toward a wall they've chosen to walk into. Then she picked up the phone and pressed a button. Clyde, I've got a customer here who'd like to discuss a loan. Virgil Suttles. He's been with us over 50 years. She hung up and nodded toward the office. Go on in. Virgil walked across the carpet. His boots left faint dust marks on the dark blue pile. He knocked once on the open door. Clyde Halstead looked up from his laptop. He was younger than Virgil expected. 33, 34 maybe. He stood and extended his hand across the desk. Good grip, quick smile. The kind of greeting that was practiced more than felt, but Virgil didn't hold that against him. Young men in suits often needed time to learn the difference between polished and genuine. Mr. Suttles, have a seat. What can I do for you? Virgil lowered himself into the chair. It was one of those modern chairs with thin padding and chrome arms, the kind that looked good in a catalog and felt like sitting on a board. He set his hands on his knees. I need a loan, $5,000. Clyde nodded and turned to his computer. Virgil watched his eyes move across the screen. He knew what was happening. He'd been thinking about this moment for weeks, ever since he'd heard the old manager had been transferred and a new man had been sent from the regional office. He'd come here on purpose, not for the money, for the man. Pulling up your account now, Clyde said. He clicked a few times. His expression didn't change, but his typing slowed. Virgil could see the recognition settling in the quick mental math that bankers do when the numbers on the screen don't match the person sitting in front of them. A checking account with $14.37. A savings account with $812. No credit cards, no investment accounts, no line of credit, just the bare financial profile of a man who looked exactly the way Virgil looked. Right now, old overalls, worn boots, calloused hands, 78 years of weather and work carved into every line on his face. Clyde had been dealing with pressure from the regional office for weeks. 3 bad loans had gone delinquent in his first month at the branch, and his supervisor had sent an email flagged urgent with a list of risk indicators to watch for. Elderly applicants with no documented income stream, accounts with balances below $500, requests for unsecured personal loans without collateral. Virgil Suttles checked every box on that list. Clyde wasn't cruel. He wasn't dismissive by nature. He was a young man under pressure doing what the system told him to do, and the system told him to say no. And what would the loan be for, Clyde asked. Farm equipment. My combine needs a new header. I see. Clyde folded his hands on the desk. What collateral would you be offering? My word, Virgil said. Clyde paused. He glanced at the screen again and cleared his throat. Mr. Suttles, I appreciate you coming in, but based on what I'm seeing here, your current balances don't support a $5,000 unsecured loan. Your checking shows $14. Your savings has just over $800. That's right. And at your age, without a steady income source showing in our system. Clyde straightened a pen on his desk. The gesture was small, automatic, the kind of thing people do when they're uncomfortable but trained not to show it. I'm not able to approve this. The numbers just aren't there. He paused. We do have a senior assistance program through the county. I could get you the paperwork for that if you'd like. The room went quiet. Virgil looked at Clyde for a long moment. Not with anger, not with hurt. He looked at him the way a farmer looks at a fence post that's been set in the wrong spot. Not the post's fault exactly, it just wasn't where it needed to be. The young man had looked at a screen and seen $14 and decided that was the whole story. He hadn't asked about other accounts. He hadn't opened the full profile. He hadn't read Darlene's note. He'd looked at Virgil's boots and Virgil's age and Virgil's overalls, and he'd decided before Virgil finished sitting down that he already knew everything he needed to know. "Thank you for your time," Virgil said. He put his hands on the armrests and pushed himself up. His right knee locked for a moment the way it did when he'd been sitting too long in a chair that wasn't built for a man who'd spent his life standing in fields. Clyde stood too, looking relieved already, reaching for the next file on his desk. "Mr. Suttles, I really am sorry if your situation changes." "It won't," Virgil said quietly. He walked out of the office. He went straight to the teller counter. Darlene was waiting. She'd been watching through the glass wall the entire time, and her jaw was tight in the way it got when she was angry and choosing not to show it. She already knew how it had gone. She'd known before Virgil sat down. "How did it go?" she asked. "About how you expected." "Virgil, it's not all right." "It's all right, Darlene." He leaned on the counter and lowered his voice. The bank was nearly empty. One other customer sat at the far desk, filling out a deposit slip, a woman from the church choir who would later tell everyone she knew what she'd seen that morning. "Darlene, pull up my other account." Darlene looked at him. Her expression changed, not surprise, something deeper. She'd been waiting for this. Maybe not today, maybe not this week, but she'd known it was coming. She'd watched Virgil carry something heavy for 2 years, a promise he'd made to a dying woman, and she'd known that sooner or later he would need to set it down. "You sure?" she asked. "I'm sure." She turned to her computer and typed. She knew the account number by heart. The screen changed. Darlene glanced at it, then looked at Virgil. He nodded once. She turned the monitor, not toward Virgil, toward the glass-walled office behind him, where Clyde Halstead sat reviewing his next file, already moving on with his morning. The screen showed the Virgil and Opal Suttles Family Trust. Balance $12,417,832. For a few seconds, nothing happened. The number just sat there, on the screen, glowing enormous, impossible, like a whale surfacing in a swimming pool. Then Clyde looked up. His eyes found the monitor Darlene had turned toward him. He squinted. Then he stood. His chair rolled backward and hit the wall behind his desk. His face went white. Not pink, not flushed. White. The color of a man who has just realized that the ground beneath him is not where he thought it was. Virgil didn't look back. He kept his eyes on Darlene. His voice was steady and quiet, the same voice he used when he talked to the soybeans in the South field on mornings when the weather was uncertain and the crop needed patience more than rain. "I didn't need the money," he said. "I needed to see the man." Darlene's eyes were wet, but she didn't cry. She just nodded the way people nod when something they've been expecting finally arrives, and it's exactly as heavy as they thought it would be. "I'll be back Monday," Virgil said. "I need to talk to someone about a transfer. A large one, but not with him." He tilted his head slightly toward the office. "Not yet." Behind them, Clyde had come to his office doorway. He stared at the number on the screen, then at Virgil's back, then at the number again. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. The woman at the far desk had stopped writing. She was staring at the monitor too, though from her angle she couldn't read the exact number. She could read Darlene's face, and Darlene's face was enough. Virgil tapped the counter once with his knuckle and walked out. The bell chimed behind him. Darlene turned the monitor back. She looked at Clyde, still standing in his doorway, still pale, still silent. "I told you to read the full profile," she said. She turned back to her computer. The conversation was over. Outside, Virgil sat in his truck in the parking lot. He didn't start the engine. A sparrow landed on the hood and looked at him through the windshield, its head tilted sideways the way birds do when they're trying to figure out if something is dangerous or just large. "Well, Opal," he said, "you were right about this one. The old manager would have known. This new fella doesn't see past the boots." He was quiet for a moment. "But I've been thinking about what you wanted, the community center. You said wait until I found the right people. I think I've waited long enough." The sparrow hopped twice and flew off. "I'm going to build it, Opal. 2 million, just like we talked about, and I'm going to put your name on it." He sat there a while longer, and while he sat, the years came back to him, the way they always did when he was alone in this truck, in this seat with the empty seat beside him. Opal had been an accountant before they married. She understood money the way Virgil understood soil. He knew seeds and weather and the patience a crop demanded. She knew interest rates and tax shelters and what 50 years of careful investing could build when you never touched the principal and never told a soul. Together, they had made something enormous without making a sound. The money came from three places. The first was mineral rights on the back 40 acres. In 2004, a natural gas company came looking for drilling leases across the county. Most farmers signed whatever was put in front of them. Opal refused. She'd read an article in the county newspaper about gas deposits in the region and spent 2 weeks researching land surveys and mineral assessments at the county clerk's office. She insisted on getting their land professionally surveyed before signing anything. Virgil would have let it go. Opal wouldn't. The survey came back showing significant natural gas reserves, and Opal negotiated a sale of the mineral rights for $3.2 million more than triple what the gas company had originally offered. The second source was a seed patent. Virgil had spent years developing a drought-resistant soybean hybrid in test plots along the creek behind the barn. 6 generations of plants, each one carefully selected and cross-pollinated with soil chemistry notebooks written in handwriting so small you needed a magnifying glass to read it. When a major agricultural company came looking for new genetics in 2009, they sent 2 men in dark suits to the Suttles' kitchen table. Virgil sat in the corner and let Opal do the talking. They offered a number. Opal shook her head and placed a thick folder on the table, her own research on comparable patents, market pricing for similar genetics, average royalty rates in the industry. She asked for 3 times their offer. The 2 men looked at each other. They looked at this woman in a flannel shirt, sitting at a farmhouse kitchen table, negotiating like a Wall Street attorney. They accepted. On the way to their car, one of them turned back and asked Virgil what his wife had done before farming. "Accounting," Virgil said. The man shook his head. "You should thank God for that every day." Virgil looked at him. "I do," he said. The royalties from that patent had been paying out every year since. The third source was Opal herself, every dollar that didn't go toward feed, seed, or taxes she invested. Quietly, carefully, for 50 years, she had a degree in accounting and the same patience her husband brought to farming. Where Virgil waited on crops, Opal waited on compound interest. It was the largest portion of the trust, now larger than the mineral rights in the patent royalties combined. 50 years of discipline compounding silently in accounts that nobody in Hadley knew existed. They'd never changed how they lived. Same house, same truck, same overalls. Opal used to say the money wasn't theirs to spend, it was theirs to use. And she had a very specific idea about how she wanted to use it, an idea she carried for years and finally spoke aloud in a hospital room where the light hurt her eyes and the cancer was taking everything except her voice. Virgil started the engine. The truck coughed twice and turned over. He pulled out of the bank parking lot and headed east toward the farm. At the kitchen table that evening, he opened the folder he'd been putting together for months. Legal papers, architectural sketches on graph paper drawn in his own cramped handwriting, a photograph of the old community center before it burned down 4 years ago, the red brick building with white trim where Opal had run the summer reading program for 15 years, organized the Thanksgiving dinners, taught an evening accounting class for anyone who wanted to learn how to balance a checkbook. When that building burned, something in the town went quiet. People stopped gathering. The empty lot behind the post office became just another patch of weeds and chain link fence. Opal had talked about rebuilding it. For years she'd talked about it, even in the hospital, even in those last months. "Promise me, Virgil," she'd said, holding his hand in the room where he'd slept in a chair every night for 7 months. "Build it, not for me, for them." He'd promised. Before he opened the folder, Virgil picked up the phone and dialed Gail Whitfield. Gail was 76, a retired elementary school teacher, and the closest friend Opal ever had. They'd known each other for 40 years, taught Sunday school together, sat next to each other at every town meeting and church supper for as long as anyone could remember. Gail was also the only person outside of Darlene who knew about the trust. Opal had told her during those final months at the hospital, not because she needed to, but because she needed someone besides Virgil to understand what the money was for and where it was supposed to go. Gail answered on the second ring. "It's time," Virgil said. "I'm doing what Opal wanted." Gail was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Finally, I was beginning to think you'd wait forever." Virgil asked if she'd be willing to serve on a small board of trustees to oversee the construction. Gail's voice cracked slightly when she answered, "Opal would pull my ear if I said no." They talked for a few more minutes, and then Virgil hung up and sat in the quiet kitchen. The folder was open in front of him. Opal's photograph stared up at him from the top of the pile, standing in front of the old community center in 1998, holding a stack of books for the reading program, smiling the way she always smiled when she was doing something for someone else. He picked up his pencil and started writing notes on the back of one of the sketches. Square footage, room layouts, where the kitchen should go, where Opal's reading room would be. He was still writing when the sun moved past the window and the kitchen went dim. He didn't get up to turn on a light, just kept working the pencil, scratching against paper in the quiet house, filling in the margins of a building his wife had dreamed about in a town that didn't yet know what was coming. He didn't know yet that the lot behind the post office where the old center had stood was already the subject of a quiet negotiation. Eldon Fenwick, 62 years old and the chairman of the Hadley Town Council, had spent the last 3 months working a deal to sell that property to a commercial developer who wanted to build a convenience store and parking lot. The deal was nearly closed. Eldon stood to collect a significant broker's fee, and he had no idea that a 78-year-old farmer with $14 in his checking account was about to make that deal irrelevant. Back at the bank, the story had already started moving faster than anyone could control. The woman filling out the deposit slip on Saturday morning had watched the whole scene unfold. By Sunday afternoon, every pew at church had heard some version of it. By Monday morning, the story had reached the diner, the post office, and every front porch on Main Street. The details shifted with each telling. Some said Virgil had 50 million. Others said 100. One version had Clyde begging Virgil not to close his accounts. None of them were accurate, but all of them carried the same truth at the center. The old farmer was rich, and the new banker had made a fool of himself. Jolene heard it from 3 different customers before the breakfast rush ended. She looked at the third stool, from the left his stool, and thought about all those Saturday mornings. $2 eggs, $3 tip, A man who never complained, never bragged, never asked for anything extra. Something turned in her chest, something she couldn't name yet but would come to understand later when the pieces fell into place one by one. That Monday evening, Clyde Halstead sat alone in the small apartment the bank rented for him above the hardware store. He'd arrived at the bank at 7:30 that morning, an hour before anyone else, and pulled up Virgil Suttles' full customer profile, the one he should have opened on Saturday. Everything was there: the trust account, the mineral rights income, the seed patent royalties. Darlene's note flagged in the system for years: priority client, full review required for any transaction. He had never read the notes. He sat on the edge of his bed in the dark apartment and thought about his father, a mechanic in a town not much bigger than Hadley. Oil-stained work shirts with his name stitched on the pocket, a pickup truck with rust on the fenders, and a toolbox in the bed that weighed more than most of the cars he worked on. Clyde had been embarrassed by him as a teenager, took different routes to school so his friends wouldn't see the shop. Never let his father pick him up out front. His father never said a word about it, just kept working, kept paying the tuition, kept showing up every morning with grease under his nails and a lunch pail in his hand. Clyde hadn't thought about that in years. He was thinking about it now. He called his wife, told her everything: the old farmer, the loan, the denial, the $12 million on the screen. Darlene's silence, which was worse than anything she could have said. Della listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "What are you going to do about it?" she asked. "I don't know yet." "Figure it out, Clyde, because it sounds like you owe that man more than an apology." The next morning, Darlene knocked on Clyde's office door. She stepped inside and closed it behind her. She didn't sit down. "I want to tell you about Virgil Suttles," she said, "and I need you to listen." She told him everything: how Opal came in every month with a deposit, sometimes $50, sometimes $500, whatever they had extra after feed and seed and taxes. How Darlene watched the trust grow from nothing into something remarkable over decades of patience and discipline. How Virgil had never missed a tax payment in 55 years. Never bounced a check, never asked for an extension or a favor he didn't earn. "Sometimes the richest man in town is the one nobody notices," Darlene said. "You looked at his boots and decided he wasn't worth your time. That's what happened Saturday." "I know," Clyde said quietly. Darlene didn't soften. "I'm not trying to make you feel bad. I'm telling you so you understand. Virgil didn't come in to embarrass you. That's not who he is. He came in to find out if you were someone he could trust." "Trust with what?" "That's not for me to say," Darlene answered. She left and closed the door behind her. Clyde sat in his office for a long time after that, staring at his own reflection in the dark laptop screen, seeing his father's face where his own should have been. Virgil Suttles had 3 stops to make on Monday morning, and every one of them would change the shape of something before the day was done. The first was the hardware store. Otis stood behind the register sorting lag bolts into bins, the same thing he'd been doing for 40 years. 80 years old, built square and solid like a man, assembled from lumber and stubbornness, with hands that had gripped tools since before most people in Hadley were born. His wife had died 6 years ago, and since then, Otis had become the kind of man who arrived at his store at 5:30 every morning because the alternative was sitting in an empty kitchen listening to the clock. "Virgil." Otis looked up from the bolts. "Heard something interesting at church yesterday." "That, right. Inez Gresham told me you walked into the bank Saturday and turned Clyde Halstead white as a bedsheet." Virgil picked up a ball of wood screws and studied it, turning it slowly in his hands as if the label contained information he hadn't seen before. "News travels." "In this town it sprints," Otis said. Virgil set the box down. "I went in for a loan, $5,000. He said no. And then I had Darlene show him the trust balance. Otis set down the bolt in his hand. His fingers went still, which was unusual for Otis. His hands were always moving, always sorting or adjusting or tightening something. How much did he see? All of it. Otis whistled low and long. 12 million and change. Why, Virgil? You could have just walked out. Virgil was quiet for a moment. He looked past Otis at the wall of tools behind the counter. The pegboard hung with wrenches and pliers and tape measures, all of it organized with the obsessive precision of a man who believed that everything in the world had a correct place, and most people were too lazy to find it. The ones who help you when they think you've got nothing, Virgil said, those are the ones worth trusting. I needed to know what kind of man was sitting in that office. And he's not the kind I need, not yet anyway. Otis leaned on the counter. Not yet. So what do you need him for? Virgil looked at Otis directly. He'd known this man for 50 years. They'd buried their wives within 2 years of each other. They'd sat together on Otis's porch the night after Opal's funeral drinking coffee because neither of them drank alcohol and neither of them could sleep, and Otis had said nothing for 3 hours except, "You don't have to talk, Virgil," and that had been exactly right. Opal's community center, Virgil said. Otis's hands went still again. This time his whole body went still. I'm doing it. Going to see a lawyer today. Setting up the fund. $2 million. Otis stared at him for a long count. Then he walked around the counter, stepped past the socket sets and the plumbing aisle, and put his arms around Virgil Suttles. Just grabbed him. Otis was not a man who hugged. Hadn't been since the funeral. But he grabbed Virgil and held on, and Virgil let him, standing there between the pipe fittings and the electrical tape, two old men holding each other up in a way that neither of them would have been able to describe, and neither of them needed to. Opal would be so damn happy, Otis said. His voice had gone rough the way voices go when the throat tightens and the words have to squeeze through. I know, Virgil said. Otis pulled back and wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, quick and hard, the way men of his generation handle tears. What do you need from me? Keep it quiet. The bank part is already out. The community center stays between us until the paperwork is done. A week, maybe 2. Done. Virgil left the hardware store and drove 20 miles to the next town. The law office was straightforward. He laid out the plan, the lawyer read the documents, and they agreed on a timeline. The fund would be established by Thursday. Virgil would select the board of trustees himself. The money would come from the family trust designated specifically for the construction and operation of a community center to be named after Opal Suttles. He drove home satisfied that the machinery was in motion. What he didn't know was that the machinery had already sprung a leak. An assistant at the law office mentioned the filing to a friend over coffee that afternoon. By Tuesday evening, the friend had told her sister, and the sister had told her husband, and the husband happened to work at the county clerk's office alongside a woman who served on the Hadley Town Council. By Wednesday morning, Eldon Fenwick knew everything. Eldon Fenwick was 62 years old, lean and angular, with a salesman's smile that appeared quickly and vanished the moment the conversation stopped being useful. He'd served as chairman of the Hadley Town Council for 8 years, not because he loved public service, but because the position gave him access to information before anyone else had it, and information in a small town was the only currency that mattered more than money. Eldon had spent 3 months negotiating the sale of the vacant lot behind the post office to a commercial developer from the city. A convenience store and parking lot, 12 part-time jobs, and $15,000 a year in property tax revenue. The council had taken a preliminary vote in favor. Eldon stood to collect a broker's fee that represented the largest single payday of his career. And now a 78-year-old farmer was about to turn that payday into a pile of ashes. Eldon drove out to the Suttles farm on Thursday afternoon. Virgil was on the porch sitting in the wooden chair on the left, the one that had always been his. Opal's chair sat empty on the right where it had sat empty for 2 years, and Eldon noticed that it was the only piece of furniture on the entire porch that had no dust on it, as though someone wiped it down every day. Virgil watched Eldon's sedan pull up the gravel drive and come to a stop. He didn't stand, he just watched. Eldon climbed the porch steps and stood at the railing, hands in the pockets of his khakis, his jacket open despite the cool air. He was trying to look casual and failing at it. "Virgil, I heard about your plans for the lot behind the post office." Virgil took a sip of coffee. Word gets around. "The council took a preliminary vote on that property 3 months ago," Eldon said. "We've got a developer ready to sign. Convenience store parking lot, 12 jobs. Real revenue for this town." Virgil looked at him. He said nothing. Eldon shifted his weight. "I respect what you and Opal meant to this community, Virgil. I do. But this town needs economic development. It needs tax base. A community center is a nice idea, but nice ideas don't pay salaries." Virgil set his coffee on the porch railing. "How much is the developer paying for the lot, Eldon?" Eldon told him the number. "I'll pay double," Virgil said. "Buy the usage rights from the town, build the center, and the town keeps permanent ownership of the land." Eldon's mouth opened, then closed. He hadn't expected a counteroffer. He'd expected nostalgia and sentiment, the kind of argument he could dismantle with spreadsheets and common sense. He hadn't expected a man who could simply outbid the competition without blinking. "I'll need to take that to the council," Eldon said. "Take it. I'll be there." Eldon turned and walked down the steps. At the bottom, he stopped and looked back. Virgil was watching him with an expression Eldon couldn't read, and that bothered him more than the money. Eldon Fennick was a man who prided himself on reading people. He could tell within 30 seconds of meeting someone whether they were bluffing. Virgil Suttles wasn't bluffing, and he wasn't posturing, and he wasn't angry. He was just sitting on his porch drinking coffee, and somehow that was the most unsettling thing Eldon had encountered in years. That evening, Gail Whitfield came to the farmhouse. She carried a cardboard box under one arm and let herself in through the kitchen door without knocking, the way she'd done for 40 years. Virgil was at the table with his sketches spread out in front of him. Gail set the box on the table and opened it. Inside was a notebook, spiral-bound, the cover soft and worn from handling. Virgil recognized the handwriting on the first page before Gail said a word. Opal's handwriting, small and precise, slanting slightly to the right, the way it always had. "She gave this to me at the hospital," Gail said. 3 weeks before the end. "She told me to keep it until you were ready." Virgil picked up the notebook. His hands trembled. It was a small movement, barely visible, but Gail saw it because she was looking for it. In all the years she'd known Virgil Suttles, she had never once seen his hands shake. Not at the funeral, not at the hospital, not in the weeks after, when he sat on this porch alone every evening and watched the sun go down over fields that suddenly seemed too large for one man to manage. His hands had always been steady. They weren't steady now. He opened the notebook. The first pages contained lists of programs Opal had planned for the new community center. Summer reading group for children. A Tuesday evening accounting class free of charge, open to anyone who wanted to learn. Thanksgiving dinners for the whole town. A Saturday morning coffee hour for seniors. Each program was described in detail with notes on scheduling, volunteer needs, estimated costs, and the names of people Opal thought would be willing to help organize. On the first page above the list, Opal had written a single sentence in letters slightly larger than the rest. "A town is only as strong as its kindest people." Virgil read it twice. He closed the notebook and held it against his chest for a moment, pressing it flat against the flannel, as if he could push the words through the fabric and into his ribs where they would be safe. She knew you'd need this, Gail said. She knew you'd get to this point and start wondering whether you were doing it for the right reasons. She wanted you to have the answer in her own handwriting. Virgil didn't speak. He set the notebook down on the table beside the sketches and placed his palm flat on top of it. The town council meeting was held the following Tuesday evening in the small room at the back of the town hall. 40 people showed up, which was more than had attended any council meeting in recent memory. Word about Virgil's offer had spread, and word about Eldon's opposition had spread faster. The room was tense in the way small town rooms get tense, with everyone smiling politely and nobody saying what they actually thought until someone broke first. Eldon presented his case: the developer's offer, the 12 trillion, the tax revenue. He used the phrase fiscal responsibility 3 times and practical investment twice, and finished with the line he'd clearly rehearsed. We need to think with our heads, not our hearts. Virgil stood up. He didn't walk to the front of the room. He just stood at his seat in the third row, hands at his sides, and waited. The room went quiet the way it always did when Virgil Suttles stood up, not because he was loud or commanding, but because he was so rarely moved to speak that when he did, people understood it mattered. He didn't talk about money. He talked about the old community center. He talked about the Pruitt family losing their son in 2008, a car accident, and how the center had been the place where the funeral reception was held when the family couldn't afford anything else. He talked about Tuesday evenings when Opal stood at the front of the meeting room and taught anyone who showed up how to read a bank statement and balance a budget. He talked about the night the ice storm knocked out the power across the county and the whole town gathered in that building and ate by candlelight, 100 people sharing food and warmth because they had a place to share it in. Eldon asked what this town needs, Virgil said. I'm asking what this town is missing. 4 years we've been missing the place where we come together. 12 part-time jobs don't replace that. Gail stood next. She held up Opal's notebook and read from it. Not the whole list, just enough. The reading program, the accounting class, the holiday dinners. She read the names of volunteers. Opal had already identified people sitting in that very room, and several of them straightened in their chairs when they heard their names spoken in a dead woman's handwriting. The council voted 4-1. Eldon Fenwick cast the only dissenting vote. He stood up and walked out of the room without looking at anyone, and the door closed behind him with a sound that was louder than it needed to be. 300 miles north, in a 14th-floor apartment in Chicago, Boyd Suttles sat at his kitchen table at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night and stared at the papers surrounding him. Bank statements showing balances that shrank every month. Collection notices printed on paper designed to feel urgent and threatening. A letter from a lawyer representing investors in a real estate deal that had collapsed 6 months ago and taken most of Boyd's savings with it. Boyd was 48. He had left Hadley at 18 and built a life designed to prove he was more than a farmer's son. College on scholarship, business degree, 20 years of corporate consulting, managing budgets and timelines for companies whose names looked impressive on a resume and meant nothing to him at 3 in the morning when the apartment was dark and the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. He'd made good money. He'd spent most of it trying to look like the kind of person who made good money. And 6 months ago, one bad investment had revealed the whole structure for what it was: hollow. He hadn't been home in 3 years, not since his mother's funeral, when he'd driven down on a Friday and left on a Sunday and stood on the farmhouse porch and raised one hand in a wave. His father barely returned before Boyd pulled out of the driveway. He told himself the distance was about time and schedules and the demands of his career. The truth was simpler and uglier. He'd spent 30 years running from the farm, and now that his life was falling apart, he couldn't bring himself to call the one person who would have helped without asking a single question. His phone rang at 11:15, Otis's number. Boyd, Otis, it's late. Calling anyway. Your father walked into the bank on Saturday and did something you need to hear about. Otis told him everything. The loan, the denial, the trust balance on the screen, Clyde Halstead going pale, Virgil walking out without raising his voice, and then the part Boyd wasn't expecting. There's more. He's building a community center, your mother's name on it, $2 million. Boyd closed his eyes. He promised Opal, Otis said. Before she passed, the old center burned down and she wanted it rebuilt. He's been carrying this since the hospital. He's building it alone, Boyd. He shouldn't have to. Your mother would want you there. You know that. Boyd looked at the papers on his table, the bank statements, the collection letters, the whole carefully constructed life he'd built to get away from a 400-acre soybean farm and a man in overalls. I'll think about it, he said. Don't think too long. Otis hung up. Boyd sat in the quiet apartment. The city hummed outside, distant and indifferent. He picked up his phone and opened the airline app. There was a flight Friday morning to the regional airport, $189 one way. He couldn't afford a round trip. He bought the ticket anyway. Boyd pulled into the farm driveway just after noon on Friday. The fields were green on both sides of the gravel road, and the farmhouse appeared around the last curve, looking exactly the way it had looked in every memory he'd carried for 30 years. White paint, green shutters. Opal's garden blooming out front because Virgil still watered it every evening, bending down with the hose at 6 o'clock, regardless of the weather, tending flowers planted by a woman who would never see them again. Virgil was on the porch. He sat in the wooden chair on the left, a cup of coffee in his hand, looking out at the fields. He didn't stand when Boyd stepped out of the rental car. He just watched his son walk across the yard, up the steps, and stop at the top. They looked at each other. Boyd was taller than his father, but felt smaller standing there. Hey, Dad. Virgil set his coffee on the porch railing. He stood up slowly, his right knee catching. Boyd. They stood 3 feet apart. Boyd opened his mouth to deliver something he had rehearsed on the flight, some combination of apology and explanation that had sounded reasonable at 30,000 feet and sounded hollow now. Virgil stepped forward and put his arms around his son, not tight, not dramatic, just steady. The way you hold something you've been waiting to hold for a long time and don't want to risk breaking by squeezing too hard. Dad, I'm sorry I haven't been... You're here, Virgil said. That's enough. They ate lunch at the kitchen table. Potato and ham soup, Opal's recipe. Boyd had eaten it 1,000 times growing up and hadn't thought about it in years. Opal's apron still hung on the hook by the stove, and when Boyd saw it, something tightened in his chest, a knot that had been forming for 3 years and suddenly pulled taut. After lunch, they walked the property. Virgil showed him the changes. New fence along the north line, drainage ditch behind the barn, the test plots along the creek, smaller now than they used to be. Then Virgil spread the sketches on the hood of the truck. Floor plans in his cramped handwriting. A main hall, a kitchen, 2 meeting rooms, a library, and a small room off the main hall labeled in pencil Opal's reading room. Boyd held the page close and didn't trust his voice for a moment. That evening, they walked the fence line behind the barn as the sun dropped toward the tree line and the light came in low and gold across the soybeans. Boyd had been carrying his confession since Chicago, and it came out the way confessions do, awkward and raw, and more painful for the telling than the keeping. Dad, I need to tell you something. I'm in trouble. Financially. Bad investment about 6 months ago. Real estate deal that went sideways. I lost most of my savings, collection notices, lawyer letters. My credit is ruined. I'm 48 years old and I'm broke. I couldn't even afford a round-trip ticket to get here. Virgil kept walking. His pace didn't change. His expression didn't change. When he spoke, there was no judgment in his voice. Just a question. Why didn't you call me? Because I was ashamed. Boyd stopped walking. I left this place because I was embarrassed by it. The farm, the town, the truck. I wanted something bigger, something that looked like success, and I built it, and it turned out to be empty. He looked at his father. You were here the whole time, $12 million in the same boots you've worn since I was in high school, planning to give half of it away. And I couldn't manage my own savings account. Virgil stopped too. He turned to face his son in the fading light. Boyd, I don't care about the money. Not yours, not mine. Money is just a tool. Your mother taught me that. What I care about is that you're standing here. That's what matters. They stood in the quiet field for a long moment. I could use some help, Virgil said, with the community center. The fund is set up, the paperwork is done, but I need somebody to manage the project day to day. Construction budgets, contractors. I'm too old to run it myself. You're asking me. I'm asking if you want to. Dad, I've managed budgets and timelines for 20 years. This is literally what I do. Then you'd be good at it. Boyd almost smiled. First time in months. Yeah, he said. I'll do it. Ground broke on the first Monday in June. Boyd was at the site by 7 in the morning with a clipboard and a hard hat he'd bought at Otis's store. Otis laughed at the hard hat. Boyd wore it anyway. Thurman Cargill showed up the same morning driving a white truck with Cargill Construction stenciled on the door. Thurman was 55, broad-shouldered, with a handshake designed to communicate competence and a resume that looked clean on paper. Boyd had reviewed 4 bids and selected Thurman's because it was the lowest by a significant margin, and because Thurman said all the right things in the interview, things about timeline and quality and respecting the client's vision. Boyd would later learn that saying the right things and doing the right things were 2 different skills, and Thurman Cargill had only mastered one of them. 3 weeks into construction, Boyd was reviewing invoices at the kitchen table when a number caught his eye. The lumber order for the second phase showed 400 board feet more than what was actually on site. He pulled the previous 2 invoices. Same pattern, each one inflated by 15 to 20%, the difference small enough to miss on a casual review and large enough to add up to thousands of dollars over the life of the project. Boyd drove to the construction site the next morning and found Thurman supervising a concrete pour. He asked to speak privately. They walked to the far side of the lot away from the crew. Boyd laid 3 invoices on the hood of Thurman's truck side by side next to the delivery receipts from the lumber supplier. The numbers didn't match, not even close. Thurman looked at the papers, then at Boyd. His face went through 3 expressions in quick succession: surprise that he'd been caught, an annoyance that he had to deal with it, and finally a kind of aggressive dismissal that Boyd recognized from 20 years in corporate boardrooms. It was the look of a man who'd been caught cheating and decided to act offended instead of sorry. That's a paperwork error, Thurman said. Happens all the time in construction. It happened 3 times in a row, Boyd said. Each time in the same direction. Look, Thurman crossed his arms. You're from the city. You don't understand how things work out here. These are standard variances. Boyd gathered the invoices and the receipts and squared them into a neat stack. This is my father's money. My mother saved every dollar of it for 50 years, one deposit at a time, in an account nobody in this county knew existed. You're not taking a single cent that isn't earned. Thurman started to respond something sharp and defensive, but Boyd cut him off. You're done. Pack your tools and clear the site by Friday. I'll have a final check for the work completed to date minus the overcharges. Thurman left. Boyd spent the next 2 weeks interviewing replacement contractors, calling references, and managing the existing crew to keep the project from stalling completely. The delay cost them 16 days. Eldon Fenwick noticed. At the next council meeting, Eldon stood and raised the contractor issue. He framed it carefully, not as an attack on Virgil, but as a concern about project management. The fund had already lost its first contractor to what Eldon called irregularities, and the project was behind schedule. Perhaps the council should reconsider whether a private citizen, however well-intentioned, was the right entity to manage a project of this scale. Gail Whitfield stood before Eldon, finished sitting down. She was 5'3" and 76 years old, and she spoke with the kind of authority that only retired teachers possess, the voice that can silence a room of 30 children, or in this case, a room of 40 adults. The contractor was caught overbilling and was terminated within 72 hours of discovery, Gail said. That's not mismanagement. That's exactly the kind of oversight this project needs. A commercial developer building a convenience store has no incentive to watch every dollar the way this board does. We do, because this money was earned one deposit at a time by a woman most of us loved, and we owe it to her to spend it right. The council declined Eldon's motion for the second time. Eldon sat through the remainder of the meeting in silence. The building went up through summer, frame then walls, then roof. People came to help without being asked. A retired carpenter showed up on Tuesday mornings and worked until noon. 3 women from the church organized a painting crew. A farmer 2 roads over donated a truckload of lumber from his barn. Clyde Halstead started appearing at the site after work, still in his dress shirt, asking Boyd what needed doing. He carried boards. He held levels. He brought coffee for the crew on cold mornings. But on a night in late August, after Thurman's departure and Eldon's second challenge and 16 days of lost schedule, Virgil sat alone at the kitchen table and felt something he hadn't felt since the hospital. Doubt. The house was dark. The sketches were spread in front of him. The notebook Gail had brought, Opal's notebook, sat at the corner of the table. Virgil stared at it and asked himself a question he'd been avoiding for weeks. Was he building this center because Opal had asked him to, or was he building it because he didn't know how to stop carrying her? Was $2 million poured into a building just a way of avoiding the fact that no building in the world could bring her back to this kitchen, to this table, to the chair that sat empty across from him right now? He reached into his shirt pocket and took out the glasses. He held them and waited for something. An answer, a feeling, a voice. Nothing came. That was the part that scared him. Not the silence itself, but the fear that silence was all there would ever be. A knock at the door. Gail, carrying a thermos of tea, letting herself in without waiting for an answer. She walked to the table and pulled out a chair. Not just any chair. Opal's chair, the one on the right side of the table that no one had sat in for 2 years. Virgil watched her sit down and said nothing, but something in his face cracked open just slightly. Just enough for Gail to see the fracture beneath. She poured 2 cups and pushed one across to him. Opal told me something in the hospital, Gail said. The last month, she said Virgil will doubt himself. He always does when I'm not there to nod beside him. But he'll do the right thing. He always does the right thing. Virgil's jaw worked. He picked up the tea and held it without drinking. She knew you'd get here, Gail said. She knew you'd sit at this table in the dark and wonder if you were building the community center or just running from grief. She knew because she knew you better than you know yourself. She always did, Virgil said. His voice was rough. That hasn't changed just because she's gone, Gail said. Virgil put the glasses back in his pocket. He didn't say anything else. But the next morning, he was at the construction site at 7, standing at the edge of the lot with his hands behind his back, watching the new crew frame the south wall of what would become Opal's reading room. Clyde Halstead came to the diner on a Wednesday in early September. Virgil was at the counter, third stool coffee and eggs. Midweek, not his usual Saturday, but he'd started coming in more often since the project began. Clyde walked in wearing khakis and a button-down no tie. He looked different than he had behind the desk. Smaller, somehow less certain. He stopped 2 stools away. "Mr. Suttles, do you have a minute?" Virgil turned his head slightly. "Clyde, I'd like to talk to you. I owe you an apology. A real one. Not the kind where I say the words and hope it goes away." Virgil nodded at the stool beside him. Clyde sat. "I looked at you that day, and I saw a number," Clyde said. $14. "I saw your clothes and your age, and I decided before you finished sitting down. That was wrong." "Yes," Virgil said. "It was. It wasn't just about the money. I didn't see you as a person. I saw what I expected to see, and I stopped looking." Virgil set his cup down and turned on the stool to face Clyde. "Let me tell you something. You remind me of my son when he was young, too busy looking at what things cost to see what they're worth." Clyde took that without flinching. "I didn't walk into that bank because I needed $5,000, Virgil said. "I walked in because I was about to put $2 million into this town, and I wanted to know if the man running the bank was somebody I could work with. And I failed." "You failed the first one. Doesn't mean you can't pass the next." Clyde looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I need somebody to manage the fund's finances at the bank. Disbursements, contractor, payments, accounting. Darlene's retiring next year. I need someone who knows numbers and who's willing to do the work. Not because it looks good on a report, because it matters." "Yes," Clyde said. "I'm willing." "Good. Talk to Boyd. He'll walk you through the budget." 2 days later, Clyde was at the construction site with a laptop. Boyd walked him through every line. 3 hours later, Clyde had reorganized the payment schedule and found $8,000 in material savings. Boyd called Virgil that night. "He's sharp, Dad. He actually knows what he's doing." "I figured." "Then why'd you test him?" "Knowing numbers isn't the same as seeing people. I needed to find out if he could do both." The weeks shortened. September turned cool and the frame filled in with walls. Otis stood at the fence most mornings watching. One afternoon, Boyd leaned on the fence beside him and asked a question he'd been holding since the day he arrived. "Otis, was he angry when I left? When I stopped coming home?" Otis was quiet for a long time. He watched the crew hang drywall on the far wall instead of looking at Boyd. "Your father never stopped being proud of you, Boyd. He just stopped saying it out loud." Boyd looked at him. "He's got a box in the closet upstairs," Otis said. "Every article you were ever mentioned in, consulting awards, client newsletters, anything with your name. Your mother used to clip them from magazines and mail them to him. After she passed, he kept doing it himself, printed things off the computer. He doesn't know how to work a computer worth a damn, but he figured out how to search your name and print the page." Boyd turned away. He gripped the fence with both hands. "He never said a word to me about any of that," Boyd said. "That's your father. He shows what he feels by what he does, always has." On a quiet Thursday evening in early October, Virgil and Boyd sat on the farmhouse porch. The air had gone cool and the crickets sang beyond the garden in the dark. Virgil had 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Boyd and sat in his chair. "The building's almost done," Virgil said. 2 weeks, maybe 3. Inspector comes Monday. You've done a good job, Boyd." Boyd looked at his coffee. "I had a good project." They sat in the quiet and then Virgil reached into his flannel pocket. Not the shirt pocket, the other one. He pulled out something small and held it in his open palm. A ring, gold worn smooth from decades of wear, with a single small diamond that caught the porch light. "Your mother's wedding ring," Virgil said. She took it off when her hands swelled during the treatments, asked me to hold it. Boyd stared at it. She told me to give it to you when the time was right. Virgil held out his hand. I think this is the time. Boyd reached out and took the ring. It was warm from Virgil's pocket lighter than he expected. He turned it in his fingers, this small gold circle that had lived on his mother's hand for 53 years and now sat in his palm, still warm, still carrying the shape of her. She was proud of you, Boyd. Never stop being proud, not even when you stopped calling. Boyd closed his hand around the ring. I'm staying, Dad. I'm not going back to Chicago. I'm going to stay and help run the center. There's nothing for me there anymore. Virgil was quiet for a moment. He took a sip of coffee and looked out at the dark fields, the same fields he'd looked at every evening for 55 years. And for the first time in a long time, the view didn't feel lonely. It felt like enough. Good, he said. I could use the company. Boyd slipped the ring into his shirt pocket without thinking about it, and it settled there against his chest close to his heart, in the same place where his father carried Opal's glasses every day. The town meeting was held on a Thursday evening in the second week of October, 3 weeks before the building was scheduled for its final inspection. Virgil had asked the town clerk to open the hall for the evening, but hadn't told anyone what he planned to say. Everyone in Hadley knew about the bank incident by now. Everyone had heard some version of the community center, but nobody had heard it directly from Virgil. And in a town of 2,200 people, the difference between a rumor and an announcement was the difference between smoke and fire. By 7 o'clock, the hall was full, folding chairs set in rows across the scuffed linoleum floor, people standing along the walls and leaning in the doorway. Jolene stood near the back with her arms crossed, her daughter Nadine beside her. Otis sat in the front row, arms folded over his chest, his jaw set in the particular way it set when he was working hard not to feel something. Boyd stood off to the side near the emergency exit, close enough to see his father's face, but far enough to stay out of the way. Gail Whitfield sat in the second row, Opal's notebook resting on her lap, her hands folded on top of it, as if she were protecting something sacred. Virgil walked to the front of the room. Someone had set up a microphone on a small stand, but he stepped past it without a glance. He stood facing the crowd, hands at his sides, and waited. The room went quiet in about 10 seconds. Not because anyone told them to stop talking, because something in Virgil's stillness communicated that whatever was about to be said deserved silence, and the people of Hadley understood that language. Most of you know me, Virgil said. His voice carried without effort, clear and unhurried. Some of you heard about what happened at the bank a few weeks back. I'm not here about that. He paused. I'm here because of Opal. The room went absolutely still. Not quiet. Still. The way a field goes still before a storm when even the wind holds its breath. My wife loved this town, Virgil said. She ran programs at the old community center for 15 years. When that building burned down, she took it hard. Harder than she let anyone see. Before she died, she asked me to rebuild it. She said a town needs a place where people come together, a place that belongs to everyone who walks through the door. He looked around the room. Every face was turned toward him. Some he'd known for decades. Some were younger people who'd grown up hearing about Virgil Suttles without ever really knowing him. He saw them all. I'm putting $2 million into a fund to build a new community center, he said. It'll be called the Opal Suttles Memorial Community Center. Construction started this summer. The building is nearly finished. Silence. One heartbeat. Two. Then someone in the back of the room started clapping. Then another person. Then the whole room was on its feet, and the applause filled the hall in a way that Virgil had not anticipated and did not entirely welcome. He stood at the front and let it happen, looking uncomfortable, the way he always looked when people focused on him. But he stayed. Jolene pressed both hands over her mouth. Tears ran down her face and she didn't wipe them. Beside her, Nadine put a hand on her mother's arm, 12 years old, and already understanding that some moments were too large for words. Otis sat in his chair and did not clap. He wiped his eyes with his sleeve and nodded once slowly. That was Otis's version of a standing ovation. Anyone who knew him understood. In the back corner of the room, Eldon Fenwick sat in a folding chair near the wall. He had come in quietly after the room filled, taking a seat where few people would notice him. He watched the crowd rise. He watched Virgil stand small and still at the center of the applause. Something moved across Eldon's face, subtle and unreadable, not defeat but recognition. The look of a man who was seeing something clearly for the first time and was not sure what to do with the clarity. He did not stand, he did not clap, but he stayed in his chair, and in its own way, that was more significant than either of those things would have been. Outside the hall, Clyde Halstead stood at the window. He'd seen the lights on from his apartment above the hardware store and walked over without planning to. He stood in the parking lot with his hands in his coat pockets, watching through the glass as the town stood and cheered for a man he'd turned away 6 months ago over $14. He could hear the applause through the walls, muffled but unmistakable. He didn't go inside. He just watched, and something in him understood that watching was enough for now, that there would be a time for him inside that room, but it wasn't tonight. The crowd settled slowly. People came forward to shake Virgil's hand. A man from the church offered to volunteer on the construction crew for the final push. A woman who ran the flower shop said she'd donate landscaping. Gail squeezed Virgil's arm as she passed and whispered something that made him nod without speaking. What happened next came without warning. The week before, Jolene had been wiping tables after the dinner rush when two older women sat in the corner booth. She'd brought them coffee and overheard their conversation without meaning to. One of them mentioned the Pruitt family, the car accident in 2008, the funeral they couldn't afford when the insurance had lapsed. Somebody paid the whole thing, the woman said. Casket flowers, the reception at the church hall. Anonymous. Roscoe Pruitt found out years later it was Virgil Suttles. The other woman shook her head slowly. When my sister-in-law needed surgery, she said an envelope showed up at her house. $3,000 cash, no name, no note. She never found out who sent it. Jolene had stood behind the counter perfectly still, the rag motionless in her hand. 5 years ago, her daughter Nadine had been in the hospital. Leukemia. The treatments worked, but the bills came faster than Jolene could manage. Double shifts 7 days a week, selling her mother's jewelry, borrowing from cousins who couldn't afford to lend, still falling behind, still watching the numbers grow, still waking at 4 in the morning to the sound of her own heartbeat because the fear was loudest when the world was quietest. Then one day the billing office called and said the balance was zero. Every bill, every procedure, every night in that room where Jolene slept in a chair beside her daughter's bed and read her stories to keep them both from falling apart. Paid in full. Anonymous donor. Jolene had begged them to say who. They couldn't. She'd spent 5 years wondering. 5 years looking at every face in Hadley and asking herself who in this town had that kind of money and that kind of heart and that kind of silence. Now standing in the emptying hall, watching people file out into the October evening, Jolene walked toward the front of the room where Virgil was putting his papers back into the folder. Most of the crowd had moved toward the back. The room was quieter now, just a few small groups talking in low voices. Jolene stopped in front of Virgil. Her eyes were red, her hands were trembling slightly at her sides. "Virgil," she said. He looked up. Was it you? Her voice was barely steady. Something in it vibrated like a wire pulled tight. The voice of a woman who had held a question for 5 years and was finally letting it out. 5 years ago, my daughter's hospital bills, every one of them. Was it you? Virgil looked at her. He didn't answer. His expression didn't change in any obvious way, but his eyes held hers with a steadiness that was itself a kind of response. I've been wondering for 5 years, Jolene said. 5 years, Virgil, laying in bed at night, trying to figure out who in this town would do that, trying to understand how someone could give that much and never say a word. She paused. I think I know. Virgil still didn't speak, but something in his face softened. Not a confession, not an admission, just the smallest shift, a loosening around the eyes, the kind of change you could only see if you were standing close enough to touch someone, which Jolene was. She put her arms around him. Virgil stood there, one hand still holding the folder, and after a moment, he placed his other hand on her back and patted it twice gently. The way you pat a child's back when they wake from a bad dream. The way you tell someone it's all right without using words. When she pulled away, she wiped her face with both hands and looked at him through wet eyes. Thank you, she said, for my girl, for everything. Virgil nodded once. Your daughter's a good kid, Jolene. That was all he said. He never confirmed it. He didn't need to. Some truths are louder in the space around them than they could ever be spoken aloud. After the meeting, Boyd drove Virgil back to the farm. They parked in front of the house and sat in the car without moving, the engine ticking as it cooled the darkness of the fields stretching out beyond the reach of the porch light. Want to walk? Virgil asked. They walked the property in the dark, not the whole perimeter, just the stretch behind the barn along the fence line where the test plots used to run thick with experimental soybeans and now grew smaller and quieter each year. The stars were out. The air smelled like cold dirt and dry leaves and the faint sweetness of harvested fields. Neither of them spoke for a long time. They just walked side by side, two men who had been separated by 30 years and 300 miles and were now walking in the same direction, on the same ground, and that was enough. The morning after the town meeting, the last person Boyd expected to see at the construction site was Eldon Fenwick. Eldon's sedan pulled up to the curb at 8:15. He got out wearing a jacket and no tie, which was unusual for Eldon, who normally dressed as though every interaction was a potential business meeting. He walked to the edge of the lot and stood there looking at the building for a full minute before Boyd noticed him and walked over. Boyd's posture tightened. Every interaction with Eldon in the past 4 months had been adversarial, from the porch confrontation to the council meetings to the rumors Eldon had circulated about project mismanagement. Boyd was prepared for another fight. Eldon looked at the building, not at Boyd. His face was different this morning. Not hostile, not calculated. Something had drained out of it overnight, some energy that had been driving him for months, and what remained was quieter and more uncertain. Do you need anyone to expedite the permits? Eldon asked. The final inspection paperwork. The occupancy certificate. I know people at the county office. I can make it move faster. Boyd studied him. You want to help? Eldon was quiet. He put his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the ground, then at the framed walls, then at the sky above the roofline. My wife died last year, Eldon said. He said it flatly, without self-pity, the way men of a certain age state facts that still hurt too much to dress up with emotion. She liked Opal. Used to talk about the old community center all the time. How she missed the holiday dinners, the reading program, the way the building felt on summer evenings when the doors were open and you could hear people laughing from the sidewalk. Eldon paused. I was too busy to listen, too focused on the next deal, the next commission, the next number on a spreadsheet. She kept talking and I kept not hearing. He looked at Boyd directly. I heard her too late, but I heard her. Boyd didn't say anything for a moment. He thought about all the things he could say about Eldon's opposition, about the council votes, about the damage Eldon had tried to do. He thought about his father sitting on the porch saying, "You failed the first one doesn't mean you can't pass the next," and realized that those words weren't meant only for Clyde Halstead. They were meant for everyone. He reached into his clipboard and pulled out a sheet of paper. The final inspection permits. 3 different county offices, each one requiring a separate filing, each one capable of delaying the project by weeks. "These are what we're waiting on," Boyd said. "If you can move them faster, I'd appreciate it." Eldon took the list. He folded it once and put it in his jacket pocket. He nodded at Boyd, not a handshake, not a reconciliation, just a small acknowledgement of 2 men who had decided to work toward the same thing, even if they'd arrived by different roads. Eldon had the permits expedited in 4 days. He never asked for credit, and Boyd never offered it. The Opal Suttles Memorial Community Center opened on the second Saturday in November. The building stood on the lot behind the post office where weeds and chain link had held territory for 4 years. It was larger than the old center and newer, with wide windows that let the morning light fill every room, but it carried the same feeling. A place that was built to hold people, not impress them. Boyd had been there since 6 in the morning, checking every room, every outlet, every door handle. He'd worn a path in the new floor by the time the caterer arrived at 8. The piano tuner came at 8:30. By 9 o'clock, the folding tables in the main hall were set with white cloths and food from 3 different kitchens across the county. Otis showed up at 9:15 and stood in the doorway. He looked at the finished building. The clean walls, the polished floors, the light falling through the windows. "Not bad," he said. "You say that every day, Otis, because every day it gets a little more true." People started arriving before 10. Cars lined the street. Families walked through the front door and looked around with the cautious wonder of people entering a space they didn't quite believe existed yet. Children ran down the hallways and slid on the smooth floors. The building filled with noise and laughter and the smell of fresh paint and warm food. Virgil pulled up in his truck at 10:30. He parked in the back away from the crowd and sat in the cab for a moment. He reached into his shirt pocket and held what was there, held it quietly without taking it out, and said one sentence in the stillness of the cab. "We did it, Opal." He walked around to the front entrance. Above the main door, a wooden plaque had been mounted the day before. Dark walnut hand carved by the same woodworker who built the bookshelves in the reading room. It read, "Opal Suttles Memorial Community Center. A town is only as strong as its kindest people." Virgil stood below the plaque and read the words twice. Boyd had chosen the quote from Opal's notebook. Seeing it carved into wood above a door she'd dreamed about made something tighten in Virgil's chest, a pressure that wasn't pain and wasn't joy, but something between them. Something that had no name, because it only exists in the space where grief meets fulfillment. He went inside. The main hall was full. Over 100 people, maybe more. Every chair taken, people standing along the walls. The mood was different from the town meeting weeks ago. That had been surprise and tears. This was celebration. People were smiling, talking, laughing. Children wove between adults. Someone had hung a banner across the far wall that read, "Welcome home." Boyd found Virgil near the entrance and guided him to the front. A small podium had been set up. Virgil had told Boyd twice he didn't want a microphone. Boyd had set one up anyway. Virgil stepped to the podium and ignored it. The room went quiet on its own. "I'm not going to talk long," he said. Opal wouldn't have wanted that. She'd have wanted the food hot and the coffee ready and the kids doing something useful. A few people laughed. The sound was warm and relieved, the laughter of people who needed permission to feel happy in a moment that was also sad. This building exists because of her. She dreamed about it for years, talked about it on drives into town. talked about it at the kitchen table, talked about it in the hospital when talking was the hardest thing she could do. The room was very still. Opal believed a town wasn't just a place where people happen to live near each other. She said it was a place where people looked after each other, where somebody's trouble became everybody's concern, where people showed up not because they had to, but because they wanted to. His hand moved towards his shirt pocket, touched it briefly, then came back down. She was the best person I ever knew. 53 years she spent making me better than I would have been alone. When she asked me to build this place, I said I would. He looked out at the room. Every face turned toward him. Some he'd known for 50 years. Some were children born after Opal died who would grow up knowing this building without knowing the woman it was named for. They would learn about her the way children learn about the people who built the things they take for granted, slowly and completely, and then all at once on some evening years from now, when they're old enough to understand what it costs to keep a promise. So here it is, Virgil said. He stepped back from the podium. The room stood. The applause came immediately full and sustained, the kind where people clap with their hands held high because holding them low doesn't feel like enough. Otis sat in the front row and did not clap. He wiped his eyes with his sleeve and nodded once slowly, the way he did when something was exactly right and no gesture could improve upon it. When the applause faded, Boyd stepped to the front. "We have someone who'd like to help us open this place properly," he said. "Some of you know her." A girl walked to the front of the room, 12 years old, tall for her age, dark hair in a ponytail. She sat down at the upright piano that the elementary school's music teacher had donated and placed her hands on the keys. Jolene stood near the back, both hands pressed together against her mouth. Her entire body was rigid with the effort of staying upright. Nadine played, a simple piece, clean and clear and unhurried. Her fingers moved over the keys without hesitation, producing notes that filled the new room and settled into its walls and floors, the way music settles into a space, claiming it, making it real. 5 years ago, these hands had been connected to IV lines in a hospital bed. 5 years ago, the doctors had told Jolene to prepare herself. 5 years ago, someone had walked into a hospital billing office and made everything zero, and that someone was standing across the room right now, watching, saying nothing, his hand resting at his side. Jolene watched her daughter play and let the tears come. She didn't wipe them. She just stood there, holding the moment with everything she had, pressing it into her memory, the way you press a flower into a book, carefully knowing it will flatten, but also knowing it will last. When the piece ended, the room applauded again. Nadine smiled and walked back to her mother. Jolene put her arm around her daughter's shoulders and pulled her close and held her there. And Nadine let her, because 12 is old enough to understand that sometimes your mother needs to hold you more than you need to be held. Virgil watched them from across the room. He didn't say anything. He just watched, and something in his face was settled and complete. In the early afternoon, Clyde found Virgil in Opal's reading room. The bookshelves smelled like fresh-cut oak. Sunlight came through the window and fell across the floor in warm rectangles. The shelves were already half filled with donated books, and 2 girls sat on the floor in the corner, reading, their backs against the wall, completely absorbed. "Virgil," Clyde said from the doorway. Virgil turned. Clyde walked in and extended his hand. "Thank you for the second chance, for trusting me with the fund, for everything you've done for this town." Virgil looked at him for a moment. Then he took Clyde's hand. Not the quick mechanical shake of a bank transaction. A full grip, firm and unhurried, the handshake of 2 men who had started badly and earned their way to something honest. "You earned it," Virgil said. Clyde's daughter, Wanda, came running into the reading room, her shoes squeaking on the new floor. She pulled a picture book from the lowest shelf and dropped to the floor beside the other children, immediately lost in the pages. Clyde watched her settle in her small body, folding into the space as if she'd always belonged there. Della appeared in the doorway behind him. "You were right to stay," she said quietly. Clyde nodded. The permanent transfer paperwork had gone through the week before. Their apartment lease was ending, and they'd put an offer on a house 4 blocks from the bank. The house needed work, a new roof, and a kitchen that hadn't been updated since the 80s. But Clyde had learned something in the past 6 months about the difference between a house that looks good and a house that feels like home. Late in the afternoon, when the crowd had thinned and the caterers were packing trays, Otis and Virgil sat together on folding chairs in the corner of the main hall. Paper plates and empty coffee cups dotted the tables. Children's drawings were taped to the wall near the door, made during a craft session someone had organized with markers and butcher paper. The drawings showed houses and trees and stick figures holding hands, the universal language of children who feel safe enough to create. Otis leaned back and looked at the ceiling. Opal would have loved this. Virgil was quiet for a moment. She would have been in the kitchen right now, making sure everyone got fed, counting heads to make sure nobody went home hungry. Otis smiled. "Remember that Thanksgiving during the ice storm? Whole town in the old building, eating by candlelight." "She made 14 pies, Virgil said. 14. I told her nobody needed 14 pies. She told me I didn't know what people needed." "She was right," Otis said. "Usually was." They sat for a while. Boyd walked past carrying a stack of empty trays to the kitchen. He waved without stopping. Nadine ran through the hall with 2 other children, all of them laughing about something, and the sound bounced off the new walls and filled the room in a way that made both old men go quiet and just listen. Otis watched Boyd disappear into the kitchen. "He's staying. He's staying. Good boy." "He's 48, Otis. Still a good boy." Virgil almost smiled. He looked around the room, the tables, the chairs, the banner, the children's drawings, the plaque above the door that he could see from where he sat, Opal's words carved into dark walnut. He thought about everything it had taken to reach this day. A denied loan, a number on a screen that changed a young banker's face, a son who flew home on a one-way ticket because he couldn't afford to go back, a contractor caught stealing, a town council chairman who fought the project twice and then quietly expedited the permits that made the opening possible, a retired teacher who carried a dead woman's notebook for 2 years because she'd been asked to, a teller who turned a computer monitor toward a glass office because she understood that some lessons need to be seen to be learned. And Opal. Behind all of it, before all of it, Opal, the accountant who married a farmer and spent 50 years turning patience into a fortune that no one knew existed. The woman who invested every spare dollar, not because she wanted to be rich, but because she understood that money properly saved, properly directed, properly given away, could outlast a life. Boyd came out of the kitchen and sat beside Virgil and Otis. The 3 of them looked out at the hall as the last daylight came through the windows. 2 old men and a middle-aged one sitting in a building named after a woman who would have been on her feet right now, wiping tables, sweeping floors, making sure the last person to leave had eaten enough and knew they were welcome to come back tomorrow. Virgil stood up. "I'm heading home." "Want me to drive you?" Boyd asked. "It's getting dark. I've been driving that road in the dark for 55 years. I think I can manage one more." Boyd didn't argue. He'd learned in the past 5 months that arguing with his father was something you could do, but the outcome never changed. Virgil shook Otis's hand. He put his hand on Boyd's shoulder and squeezed once, the way he communicated things that other men put into words. Then he walked out the back door to his truck. The parking lot was mostly empty. 3 cars, his truck, the caterer's van. The air was cold and smelled like dry leaves and chimney smoke from somewhere down the block. November in a small town when the world pulls inward and the evenings arrive early, and everything that matters happens inside behind walls, in the warm spaces people build for each other. Virgil climbed into the cab and sat there. He looked at the building in his rearview mirror. The lights were still on inside. He could see figures moving past the windows, Boyd and Otis, probably maybe a few others finishing the cleanup. The glow was warm and yellow against the gray November sky, the color of a place where people gathered, and he realized that this was the image Opal had carried in her mind for years. Not the blueprints or the floor plans or the dollar amounts. This, light in windows, people inside, warmth against the cold. He started the engine. The truck coughed twice and turned over. He pulled out of the parking lot and turned east toward the farm. The fields stretched out on both sides of the road, flat and bare. The soybeans had been harvested weeks ago, and the soil was dark and resting, waiting for winter to pass so the cycle could begin again. It was the same road he'd driven in April, the morning he walked into the bank with $14 in his checking account and $12 million in a trust nobody knew about. Same road, same truck, same man. But the passenger side felt different tonight. Not the hollow ache that had lived there for 2 years, the absence that pressed against him every time he glanced at the empty seat. Something had shifted. The absence was still there. It would always be there. But it had changed shape, softened at the edges, settled into something he could carry without it cutting him. Not because the grief was gone, because it had found its purpose. The building they had opened today was what the grief had been for. It was where the loss had always been pointing. Opal had known that. She'd known it in the hospital when she asked him to build it, and she'd known it years before that when she sat at the kitchen table making deposits into a trust fund and imagining a building that didn't exist yet, but would someday when the time was right and the man she loved was ready. Virgil turned onto the gravel drive. The farmhouse stood in the last traces of twilight, barely visible against the dark sky. White paint that would need touching up in spring. Green shutters. Opal's garden beds covered in mulch and waiting. He parked the truck and climbed out. He stood in the yard for a moment. Far off, a dog barked once and then went silent. The wind moved through the bare branches of the oak tree above the porch, a dry rattle that sounded like pages turning in an old book. He walked up the steps, past the 2 chairs, stopped at the front door. He reached into his shirt pocket. The glasses were there where they'd been every day for 2 years. He drew them out and held them in both hands. He didn't look at them. He didn't need to. He knew them the way he knew everything about Opal, by feel, by memory, by the accumulated weight of 53 years of paying attention. He'd carried them through the bank that Saturday morning when Clyde Halstead said no, and Darlene turned the screen. He'd carried them through the town council meeting when Eldon Fenwick cast his single dissenting vote. He'd carried them the night he sat at this kitchen table in the dark and wondered if he was building a community center or just running from an empty house. He'd carried them to the construction site every morning and to the diner every Saturday and to the porch every evening. He'd carried them because carrying them meant she was still with him, still close, still riding in his shirt pocket the way she used to ride in the passenger seat, present and warm and near. He held them for a long moment. Then he opened the door, walked inside, and crossed the kitchen to the table. The folder of plans was still there, the pages covered in 2 different sets of handwriting now. Virgil's cramped letters on the original sketches, Boyd's neat print in the margins. Numbers and notes and room dimensions layered together, the work of a father and son who had found their way back to each other through the building of a single room labeled in pencil as Opal's reading room. Virgil set the glasses down on the table. Not in a drawer, not put away, just placed gently beside the folder in the spot where Opal used to sit, where she'd read the newspaper aloud on winter mornings, where she'd gone over the farm accounts in her ledger, where she'd sat across from him 10,000 times over 53 years, close enough to touch, close enough to talk, to close enough to simply be with in the quiet way that long marriages run, on the way water runs constant and sustaining and easy to forget until it stops. He didn't put the glasses away because they weren't finished. They would sit on this table in the morning light, and he would see them when he came down for coffee, and they would remind him not of what he'd lost, but of what he'd done with the loss. They would remind him of a building with Opal's name on it, full of light and laughter and children reading on the floor. They would remind him that grief, when you carry it long enough and carefully enough, becomes something else. Not smaller, not lighter, just different, aimed. Virgil put the kettle on. He sat down at the table and looked out the window. The last light had faded completely, and the fields were dark, the same dark they'd been every night for 55 years. The same view from the same chair, in the same kitchen, in the same house. He picked up his coffee when it was ready and held it in both hands. The warmth moved through his palms and into his fingers and settled there. The house was still, not empty, still. The good kind of still, the kind that comes after something has been completed, after a promise has been kept, after the work is done and the tools are put away, and there is nothing left to do except sit in the quiet and know that you did what you said you would do. He didn't say anything to Opal tonight. He didn't need to. She already knew.